All right, one last thing to discuss with respect to Chinese society is demographic issues, and particularly China's population policy. We've talked a lot in all of our case studies about the advantages and the disadvantages of a growing population, a high birth rate or high fertility rate, and China has taken a particularly strong approach to controlling its population. The big historical view is that China has had just immense population growth in the last 50 to 75 years. Population has more than doubled since 1960 and is, of course, the most populous country in the world. Um, and for a variety of reasons, especially in the post-Mao era, China's leaders have come to the agreement that rapid population growth might be a problem, both from the perspective of providing social services for a growing population and more generally from the perspective of ensuring economic growth and development. Um, the consequence of that was in the 1970s the move toward a policy known famously as the one child policy. Even before the one child policy, as we know it, was implemented, in the 1970s, China's leaders increasingly encouraged people to limit the size of their families, to have fewer children, to marry later, to give birth later, and to make use of birth control. And so you saw China's birth rate start to drop pretty significantly well before the implementation of the one child policy. But then in 1979, China's planners decided that those voluntary measures hadn't gone far enough and introduced a policy known as the one child policy, which does exactly what it says on the tin, which is to restrict most families to having just one child. There were some significant exceptions that people from outside China frequently fail to notice. One is that rural families were generally allowed to have more children, it being the case that children are more economically necessary for farmers than they are for non farmers. Ethnic minorities in general were exempted from the policy. And couples where both parents were only children were, in general, allowed to have a second child. Um, the enforcement of the policy has been a matter of tremendous controversy, and there's been lots of activism outside of China trying to encourage China to drop this policy and criticizing it for the use of more coercive measures. The most widespread and consistent system of enforcement has been through a combination of sort of financial carrots and sticks. So families could be fined for violating the one child policy, although at the extreme, you would sometimes see wealthier couples kind of opt to have a second child and just pay the fine in the same way that rich people will sometimes pay a parking ticket instead of bothering to find legal parking. Um, More seriously, especially if you wanted to advance through sort of the state or the Communist Party hierarchy, you were kind of expected to follow the policy in order to set an example for people. And so people could lose their jobs, people could lose opportunities for promotions or raises. As a result of having a second child in violation of the one child policy. Especially early on, especially in the early 1980s, you did also see in some places the use of much more coercive and, if I may make a normative statement, bad measures to enforce the one child policy. And at the extreme, there are some documented cases of women being forced to undergo abortions or to undergo tubal ligations or to have IUDs inserted as a form of long lasting birth control. And so, depending where you were, depending sort of how enthusiastic the local party was in trying to restrict births, you could actually see the use of really intrusive and coercive measures to enforce the one child policy. Although in the 2000s and the 2010s, for the most part, the state kind of backed off those coercive policies and tacitly accepted more violations of the policy. Um, the result is big picture that the shape and the growth rate of China's population transformed dramatically. So on the left, you see a population pyramid for China in 1950, just after the Communist Revolution. That looks very much like Nigeria today. That's a young population and that's a growing population at what was then considered an unsustainable rate. Fast forward to 2017, and you see a very, very different looking population pyramid in which the numbers of young people contract significantly as evidence of declining birth rates. One other thing you might notice if you look closely at those numbers is a gender imbalance in China's population. At most levels, you see slightly more men than you see women, which is the result of, in an environment where the number of children your family can have is constrained. Some families did practice sex selective abortion or sex selective, at the worst cases, sex selective infanticide in order to exercise their preference for male children. In some rural areas, in recognition of this preference, the policy was later relaxed to allow families to have two children if the first child was a girl. Um, that said, if we look at birth rates in China, um, I think it's also worth noting that the one-child policy was not necessarily a significant turning point. If I'm looking at this graph, I see birth rates skyrocket starting around 1960, thanks to the end of the Great Leap Forward and the restoration of some degree of economic stability in China. But then there's a pretty considerable decline in birth rates over the next 20 years before the one-child policy is introduced. So I think it's also worth noting that those less coercive measures and also that kind of just the general effects of economic development in China probably also have at least as much, if not more, to do with reducing the birth rate than the one child policy itself. Um, More recently, and particularly under Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party has actually started to reverse its stance on whether population control is essential to economic development. And so in late 2014 and early 2015, the government started saying, actually, we're going to introduce a two-child policy now. Most notably, you can see the stamp, which was issued in 2018 or 2019, depicting a family of not one, not two, but three happy piglets as a pretty subtle indicator of that shift in policy. However, we don't have a ton of evidence yet because it's a relatively recent change, but so far it looks as if birth rates in China have actually not increased as a result. And I'm going to suggest a few hypotheses as to why that might be. The first is that even though the policy rules, even though the laws about having multiple children have been relaxed, the norms and the ideals and the values about the importance of having a small family and about the value of marrying relatively late in life have persisted and continue to influence the behavior of Chinese people. And it's much harder for policy to make people do a sudden 180 in norms than it is to change their financial incentives. The second is that as China has continued to urbanize and develop economically, many families, especially in urban areas, simply can't afford to have a second child if they don't want to, and so the policy change is not going to make a difference about their ability to afford all the expenses of raising multiple children. Finally, and I don't know how you would go about measuring this systematically, but a final hypothesis that's been floated by some analysts is that young people in China today, as generally is the case when countries economically develop, are less concerned about carrying on their legacy or their family name, or even about contributing to national economic development, and that they're more concerned about self-fulfillment. I have a hard time personally discerning how much that's a legitimate argument versus how much that's people complaining about kids these days, which, as you know, I love to do. But thought I would put that out there because it is an argument that has been made seriously. That's all for Chinese society. I'll see you tomorrow.